You are listening to the Intelligent Racer Podcast, where we look to educate and entertain the endurance racing community through discussions with racing professionals and elite age groupers.
In today's episode of the podcast, I speak with runner Chris Mocko. Not only is Chris one of the best runners in the world, but he's gone on a very interesting journey balancing his tech career with his running career, which is similar to many of us. We talk about that journey and what's next for Chris. I hope you enjoy. Chris, welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Survived Monday. Never can be upset about that.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad I'm done with the day too. So it's always good to be talking about running and stuff as opposed to work, right? So I'm really, really excited to talk to you. You're someone I've been wanting to talk to you for a while. And the reason being is, you worked in the tech industry. You left to go explore running full time. And you obviously are now back to work. So you've had that full sort of evolution and experience of both being working and athlete and then just the athlete and the pros and cons of it. And, I've always fantasized myself. So I'm not a talented athlete. So it's only a fantasy, but I've always fantasized about, what would it be like if I just did, the things I enjoyed full time as opposed to being in the cube. But before we go there, though, I just wanted to start off with maybe you could talk a little bit about your running background. How did you get into running, and what did you do growing up, and when did you start ultra running and things like that?
Yeah, I can do the Cliff Notes version of this. Even from early elementary school, my parents signed me up for like our youth track program, so we were doing kind of not very serious running, but jumping into maybe one or two practices a week and doing a meet on the weekends. That was extremely low key. Like everyone got a ribbon, everyone got medals at the end of the year. It was a good experience for having fun, but maybe didn't understand the competitive side of the sport at that point. And then slowly became more interested in it throughout high school and kind of transitioned from soccer and basketball into full-time runner. And by the end of my junior year, kind of realized, hey, there's actually an opportunity here to compete in college as well, and had the opportunity to visit a bunch of East Coast schools, primarily Ivies, on recruiting trips to see if I wanted to run for any of these schools, and enjoyed the experience. But something that stood out on one of the trips, one of the other guys started talking about the Stanford team and how talented they were and the crazy workouts they were doing. And, as a high school runner, at least at the time, I wasn't very connected to the college world. So names like Ryan Hall and Ian Dobson weren't really familiar to me, but they were both running at Stanford at the time, amongst quite a few other national champion caliber athletes. So that kind of piqued my interest in Stanford, and fortunately had a connection to the coach because he was a Virginia native himself and was able to walk onto the team. So really very quickly went from running at a very competitive high school team and being like the number 2 runner on that team to suddenly being one of the slowest guys on arguably the best program in the country. So It was quite a learning curve for me, and just entering that world was pretty overwhelming and intimidating, and I wanted to quit on numerous occasions, but slowly found my place on the team and began running the steeplechase and really loving it. And over time, I pride myself. The one accolade I had at Stanford was being awarded the most improved runner on 2 separate occasions, which
nice.
You have to be either you're improving quite a bit or you're starting at a pretty low point. So a bit of both, but really, my final year had an opportunity. I stayed for a 5th year. Had an opportunity to focus a little bit more on the athletic side of my Stanford time as opposed to just the academics, and really found myself focused and motivated in a way that I hadn't before. And I'm pretty grateful for my coach at the time was Jason Dunn, who moved on to do some bigger and better things with his athletes there, but just really inspired by his coaching and pushing me, and was able to qualify for our NCAA cross country team, and then made it in steeplechase and track. And it was just a really nice way to end my track career. And then basically after college, you don't really have the options for running on track are pretty limited to the guys who can run about 13:30 or under 4 minutes for the mile. So quickly upgraded to the longer distance races, and I think I ran my first marathon in 2010. Probably spent the next 5 years dabbling between club cross country and road marathons. Got my PRs down to 106 and 222. And at the end of 2015, decided, hey, this Western States thing sounds kind of interesting. I want to see what I could do in this sport. And since then, I've been focused on trails.
The rest is history. So one question on on your college choice. Stanford's a great school and all, but my alma mater's Cornell, and they're, Paul Terranova, Max King, Sage, all went there. Did you at least go visit Ithaca on your trip, or no?
I did. Unfortunately, I visited in the heart of the winter.
Exactly. Yeah, that could be a
probably
problem.
Not the best time. I'd been in Ithaca during the summer, so I knew it gets nice, but it was so depressing and snowy and miserable, and the thought of working out on an indoor track all winter was not appealing.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, Ithaca is an amazing place in the summer, but as a student, you're almost never there in the summer. So it's kind of one of those ironic things. But so then you as you said, you got into the ultra running world, and you're working at, you were at Stanford working in Silicon Valley, and then you left your job, and recently you've gone back to work in tech again, I think in Boulder. So can you just talk a little bit about that experience? Because I think a lot of people, do fantasize about saying, hey, how cool would it be if I went and took my passion and whether it be a sport or something else, and go do it for a profession. But I know the grass is always greener, and there's always kind of pros and cons. Can you sort of talk about the decision to leave your job and then ultimately go back to working, and just sort of how you liked running full time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dream for a lot of folks is, oh man, I want to make enough money so that I can spend my entire day outside training, biking, hiking, whatever that other passion is. And I had enough saved up that I could afford to do it for a little bit of time. And I gave myself 6 months and put, I decided to put $10,000 in my bank account. And when that ran out, I would be forced to return to normal working conditions. And fortunately for me, I won some races with prize money, and then was lucky enough to sign a contract with Nike. So my runway for continuing to do this actually was quite expanded past what I had originally expected. But I also wanted to reevaluate after Western States. That was going to be my big focus. And, I had an amazing 3 months with, I can't even count. I think I ran 6 or 7 ultra races, won a marathon in Ireland, got to be on a radio show in Dublin, had the mayor honor me with a day in San Francisco.
Awesome.
So all these really cool experiences, and did a training camp in Moab for a week. All these experiences, there's no way I would have felt comfortable saying yes to all these if I still had a full-time job. So it was awesome chance to do that. But what I did find come early July, after Western States had finished up, was that in my downtime, when I wasn't really training that hard, I had a lot of downtime.
Yeah.
And I think this is not unusual to really, after any big race that I've done throughout the last 5 years, it takes me a month or two to get excited again about training. My legs are generally ready to go a week or two after, but I'm just not super compelled to start training again. And I was in a bit of a rut for most of July and August, was stressing about racing at UTMB, and decided to back out of that, and found myself in this position where I didn't have a lot going on. When I was running 20 miles a day, now it was closer to 6 to 8. And I had a lot of idle time where I just wasn't feeling very productive or useful, and decided at that point that I really didn't want to rely solely on running, and I needed a little bit more outside of that to really keep me stimulated and focused. And I wasn't injured, thankfully, but same thing would have been true if I was injured. I would have had a really hard time, going to the gym and cross training for an hour or two every day, and then just sitting at home. And I had all this time, and I could have been much more productive, and I wish I had been, but I just wasn't feeling the excitement. And it's crazy how when you get busier and running's going better, you tend to feel more motivated even when you don't have the time. So just wasn't at a great place to be sharing my story. I stopped doing social media, like a lot of my blogging and vlogging that I had done. And I just decided, hey, this was a great run. I really enjoyed it, but I can probably, I certainly competed a lot better at Western States the previous year. So it's possible to train at the level that I want to and still have a full-time job, and maybe not the level I want to, but a level that will make me satisfied and happy. And so I decided to start applying to some jobs. I knew that I wanted a different stimulus and environment. I really, really enjoyed being in Marin, but I knew I didn't want to commute into the city. And so I kind of just did a list of cities where I could have access to trails, jobs, cute young college students, and quickly
Nice.
Boulder kind of jumped to the top of that list. So
Yeah.
it was kind of no brainer from there.
Yeah.
And I'd only spent 2 days in my life, 2 or 3 days here, but kind of gambled and packed my car and drove out here, and was fortunate enough to get a job at Twitter at their Boulder office, and have not looked back since.
Awesome. Oh man, I am envious for another reason now. Now you've done 2 things I wanted to do in my life, and I've done neither. But my second one was I always wanted to pack up. I live in New York City. I always wanted to pack up and move to Boulder or somewhere in the Rockies and just, enjoy the mountains and the outdoors and stuff. But life gets you. I love New York City. Don't get me wrong. I have a great life here, but it's just awesome to hear that you did that. I really have a lot of respect for it.
It's very difficult to upgrade from San Francisco and the trails of Marin. So I have a very high bar, and was definitely worried. And I really didn't have a lot of connections here either. But fortunately, trail runners in particular tend to be fairly friendly individuals, and haven't had much issues meeting folks here. And it's just ridiculous what sort of community they've built here.
Yeah. And you mentioned something that's interesting, because I don't think non-professionals think about this, but as a professional athlete, you need to really be good at, and you really need to enjoy resting and recovery, right? I mean, they as hard as a professional trains, they also need to have that much downtime and, nap, sleep, or whatever it is. And it sounds like you're wired in the way where you need to be constantly, stimulated and busy and challenged, right?
Yeah, that's part of it. But when I was at my highest level of training and hitting 130 to 150 miles a week, I was so tired that falling asleep was easy. Taking naps was kind of a daily part of daily routine. And so I was able to fill the day pretty quickly. And that was totally okay with me. It became more of an issue when I wasn't tired from the runs, and
Yeah.
I wasn't running as long, and I didn't do core and stretch for as long. And that's when it kind of ate at me a bit.
Right. So you mentioned Western States. So let's talk about that a little bit. So in 2016, you had a top 10 finish there. You were still working. And I'm sure that was one of the, as you said, one of the major catalysts to say, hey, I got something here. Let me continue to pursue it and see what happens. Then you come into 2017 and you had a day that you weren't expecting, a rougher day. Obviously at the 100-mile distance, that can happen to anybody. But talk about that day and the mental battles you had, and you ultimately finished, which is something that I respect the hell out of. I know you went through a really deep abyss and had to battle back, but just talk about that day and how you got through it.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't easy, and it's really hard to reset expectations mid-race. But I started the day hoping to finish on the podium, and that was kind of the goal. And the year before, finishing in the top 10 was kind of a stretch, but kind of something that I thought might be achievable. But I certainly was racing in a very different style than I planned to do in 2017 version of it. And having the experience and the confidence all helped going into it. And yeah, I think I ran incredibly intelligently for the first 60 miles. I had to let some folks go away who I thought I could run with. Held it together through Forest Hill, which is mile 62. I think at that point it moved up probably from about 15th all the way up to 5th, maybe 4th. And mile 62, picked up my pacer, started running downhill, and you have about 15 miles of downhill, roughly downhill, to the river. And about 2 miles into it, all of a sudden, my body just decided it didn't want to run anymore, and it wasn't fatigue in my legs. It was something much deeper in my body, and my best guess is that it's something to do with hydration and I think I might have overhydrated, if anything, and my salt levels were a little off, and my body didn't want to respond. And I thought, take it easy for 10 miles and you might recover, but it never happened. And ended up walking to the river, wanted to drop out pretty much every aid station, talked about what we were going to do when we hit the river, wanted to fall asleep. That was probably the biggest desire that whole time, despite pounding caffeinated gels. Just wanted to take a nap.
Yeah.
And got to the river, sat down in a chair. A bunch of my friends were there, and I talked to them, and we decided, we're gonna call it a day. And I don't know what changed, but as they were coming over to cut off my wristband, I was just like, no, I can't do this. And I got up and knew I had 22 miles to go at that point, and was probably going to go at about 3 miles an hour. So it's going to take 7 to 8 hours. It was not going to be the most fun way to spend my Saturday night, but I had enough time where I really didn't have an excuse not to finish it. And I knew I wasn't risking an injury. I wasn't throwing up. Like, the doctor had checked me and all my vitals were fine, and there wasn't anything injury related wrong with me. So those were the only reasons that I would have felt okay with dropping out. And so I'm very grateful that I talked myself out of that low moment. And once you cross the river, it was kind of, I knew it was going to happen at that point. And there were still moments I fell asleep at a cot at like mile 92, which seemed so close to the finish, but still felt very, very far away. And I had a ton of friends in town for a buddy's bachelor party, and they were all out at one of the aid stations, and they were there 4 hours earlier than I arrived, because that's when I was expected to be there. And so I missed them completely. And it was just kind of an unfortunate day in general. But I walked away from that with, zero regrets, zero disappointment, and was just very pleased with myself that I made it to the line and had an interesting story to tell. Obviously, the way that the race played out at front, who knows what could have happened if I had maintained my pace and had a good day, but it's hard to think about that when the state I was in come mile 65.
So, what did you learn from the experience? What would you do differently? Obviously, you said you think you might have hydrated a little bit too much, but, is there anything, with your going in strategy, expectations, anything you would have done differently other than, obviously the nutrition aspect?
I raced a lot leading up to it, and I don't think it necessarily taxed my body that much, but it definitely, there's definitely a mental demand to all that racing. And especially I raced in Ireland just a month or so prior, actually less than a month. It was like the start of June, and the travel and all of that was pretty demanding. And I'm not going to say I have zero regrets for doing that race, because it was a fantastic experience, but all of that racing definitely wears on you a little bit, and trying to peak for multiple races is never a great strategy. And so if I had to do it again, I probably would have eliminated 1 or 2 races, and probably also hit a harder reset in the middle of training. I was training hard basically from mid-February all the way through the end of June, and that's just a long time for me to be maintaining really high mileage. And I think doing it again, like the place I am in right now, I started training when I got to Boulder September 1st. So I'm about 6 or 7 weeks in and have another month to go before the North Face race. I think that is even borderline too long of a training cycle for me. I find even after a month, I'm starting to feel pretty good. So I definitely don't need as long of a training block to get in race shape.
So speak a little bit about the, that down period. So you got to Boulder, you didn't train for a while. You had a kind of a period of time where you weren't very motivated, and you partly you said you need that to have that mental break. But how hard is it to come back and how big of a hole did you dig yourself? Because I'm sort of out of my season now, and I've dug myself a little bit of a hole. But I also have a newborn, so I have an excuse. But now I'm starting to go back up that mountain to get out of get it back into shape, and it is brutal. So just talk about how you did it. I mean, what was your approach?
Yeah, it is extremely difficult. I tend to find myself that after a really hard race, I need to completely reset, and what that means is a lot of time not running, and the running that I do is low quality, low intensity, and I rarely change my eating habits. So what ends up happening is I put on some weight. So
yeah.
I found myself mid-August, even earlier, I was probably up to 190 pounds, and that was probably like the peak day, but I was at 190, and going into States, there were days where I'd come back from long runs and I'd be in the high 150s, and a lot of that was water weight, but just a pretty big range.
Yeah.
And so when you start training again, like, having an extra 20 pounds makes a huge difference. So not only are your legs not comfortable with the distance and the stimulus of running, but you're also carrying a lot more weight. So it just feels awful. Your clothes don't fit correctly, and it is a really, really tough first couple of weeks back.
Yeah.
And for me, it was really hard to get back into the routine, primarily because every time I wanted to get started, I would feel so awful, and it seemed like that really awesome run was so far away that I couldn't see the line of sight to that great long run or that first run where I really got the endorphins going.
Yeah.
And so I kind of kept on resetting, and it was a really tough, probably if you look at my Strava training from mid-July all the way through August, there's probably like one week of good training at like 80, 90 miles, and then I'm down to 40, then I'm back up again, or it would even be in the week where the start of the week would go well, and then I'd have one bad day, and then the rest would kind of fall apart. And, a lot of that I probably would have benefited a lot from having a coach during that time to kind of help walk me through that. But there's another part of me that's always like, I don't want structure right now. I only want to start doing this when I'm excited.
Yeah.
And so there's this difficult back and forth. And, if my recommendation, which I failed to do pretty miserably for the whole month of August, is the best way to get out of that is to get others involved. And even when you feel awful, if you're running with other people, it generally tends to help and at least distract you for a little bit of it.
Right. And I guess being in Boulder, you have a pretty good community and a set of trails there, but you're also at altitude. So, that had raised the barrier a little bit to get started, I would assume.
Yeah. So then I ended up, basically, I was at rock bottom, arriving in Boulder, and I had the altitude to get adjusted to, the weight to take care of, just getting back into shape. But I had this huge new stimulus of new environment and new trails to explore. And so I kind of set pretty low expectations and just went out and tried to enjoy the trails as much as I could. There was a lot of hiking. I don't think I did much running on any of those early days, but the promise of knowing that I'd feel better in a couple weeks made a pretty big difference. And it's kind of nice because I couldn't blame my fitness or the altitude. It was hard to know which one was the thing that was hurting me the most. So having both in play, probably a better way to adjust. It probably would have been more frustrating if I came into Boulder in really good shape and then got annihilated for 2 weeks because of the altitude.
True. Yeah. So kind of a random question and a total, switch of gears. But I noticed in 2015, you did Ironman Mount Tremblant. I actually did it in 2016. So I'm just curious how that came about. You're a runner. Did you just want to experiment and do an Ironman, or did you do other triathlons in the past?
Yeah, I dabbled a little bit. So my roommates most recently, when I lived in Marin, were both active, very competitive triathletes. And I just had a desire, it was bucket list really, to do an Ironman. And we had planned to do Tahoe the previous year, but that was the year of the forest fires.
Yeah.
some really bad fires out there, so that was canceled. And I just I just wanted to get it done, and unfortunately my timing was not great. I was training really hard for the San Francisco Marathon, which was about 3 weeks prior to that. And I should have learned, because this happens every time, but the San Francisco Marathon went really well. I was in amazing shape and thought I could immediately transition into 3 weeks of triathlon training, but didn't go well. I ended up getting really out of shape and went into the race totally unprepared, both from a fitness standpoint, but also from a triathlon specific training standpoint, like very little swimming, very little biking. So that was very scary, and I was relieved just to get to the finish. But again, that was a pretty brutal day where I ended up having some GI issues on the run, and it was super hot, and yeah, just not a good day. A lot of breaks during that, and I think I ran like a 3:50 marathon, so not what I was expecting. I was like, okay, I know my swim is going to be terrible. My bike will be average, but I'll make up time on the run, and I certainly did not make up time. So it was a brutal day, and all I remember is calling my parents afterwards and waking up to them saying, like, Chris, are you there? You still there? And apparently I had passed out on the phone. And so advice from that, the lesson learned is, 1, don't do an Ironman by yourself. 2, try to pick one that's a little bit cooler. And 3, make sure you train for it. those are the three. The 3 things that you need to do.
That's pretty good advice. And then just in terms of, obviously you have a very, very deep running background, but, and I know you obviously trained a limited amount for this, but I mean, do you feel that the swimming or biking are good cross-training sports for running, or, do you do anything else from a cross-training perspective?
Well, when I was having an issue with the motivation, I definitely spent more time on the bike than I had previously. Biking is, I think, is an amazing way to cross train. And I was actually surprised when I switched over to the trails, how similar the effort felt to biking, where biking, you're going really hard up these climbs, and then all of a sudden you're coasting on these downhills or flats.
Yeah.
It was very similar to the way trail running is, which is very different than marathon training, where it's generally a consistent effort. These trail runs, you're like basically redlining up these climbs, and then you have these downhills to recover, where you kind of forget about the lactic acid that's built up and all of the pain that you went through on that climb, because you have this opportunity to recover. So it feels a lot more like a fartlek than a tempo effort.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So we're almost out of time here. So I guess one final question is, what's kind of on your radar for next? So you mentioned you're doing the North Face 50, which is coming up. So besides that, have you thought about 2018 or any long-term goals, or, do you have your sights back on Western States eventually, or, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, a hard thing for me is I'm in the honeymoon phase of my time at Boulder, but also I'm at that really special time of training where I'm still building up mileage and intensity, and just loving every run. And there's a point generally in the next couple of weeks where all of a sudden I'm going to get real serious and be like, oh my gosh, I can do something crazy here, and start cutting out some social time and eliminate dessert and fun. And that generally tends to be where things start to go awry for me. So my top priority is figuring out a way to balance not only just work and running, but also trying to maintain some semblance of a social life. And that doesn't require me going out till 3 a.m. like I'm out of college, but it does mean, going to dinner and not just immediately getting into pajamas when I get home from work. So that's the top priority for me. And what that's going to look like for training, I don't think I'm going to be doing 130-mile weeks anymore. But I rarely ran over 100 in my build up to my first run at state. So I think it's just going to be more about getting in the quality miles and taking advantage of the time I do have to train. And I think that's going to happen because I'm just valuing my hours that much more. And the fact that it's going to be freezing cold in Boulder, I might have to start thinking about, do I cross train and just go full ski mode like everyone else does in the winter? Or am I going to be relegated to a treadmill. Who knows what happens? But next year I actually just sent an email to my family inviting them to Squaw Valley in late June. I don't have a golden ticket yet, so there's no guarantee that I'll be at the race, but my focus will be on getting back to States just because I've got quite a bit of unfinished business there. And I don't need to win the race, but I certainly would like a slightly stronger performance than what I was able to do this year. So that's going to be one of the focus. The TNF 50, I have pretty low expectations. It's going to be a really competitive race, and I'm not sure how my body is going to hold up with 50 miles without quite the mileage that I had before, but I'm excited to be back in Marin and running on my home trails. And I'm really, really hopeful that all this time at altitude is gonna translate into some magical super fitness when I get back to sea level. I really hope all this suffering pays off. So fingers are crossed there. But yeah, I'm gonna take advantage of the earliest opportunities to try to get a golden ticket for Western States, and then who knows what the second half of the year will look like. I think I made a mistake in committing to 200 milers last year, so I don't want to think about another race after States. But there's definitely a possibility that I'll try to get into, if not a race in Europe, there's quite a few competitive 100 milers here in Colorado that hopefully a year of altitude training will have me a little bit more prepared for racing at, one of these races that you're averaging over 10,000 feet for the whole race.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, that sounds
we'll see. And then at some point I got to knock out a marathon PR and try to qualify for the Olympic trials. I think having road speed and fitness can translate really well, especially to a race like TNF. So perhaps next year, if I'm ready for it after Western States, try to build for something like Chicago, and then I'd have, a good month and a half to get ready for TNF if I so chose to do it. But that's definitely a possibility. But again, I think it's very easy to get excited about the next year of training, especially when racing, when training is going so well, but trying to be a little bit more realistic, not bite off more than I can chew, and enjoy the opportunities I get.
Yeah. Oh, well, it sounds like a great plan. And I loved your answer because you started out by saying, "Hey, I want some balance. I don't, I'm in the honeymoon phase of this block and I'm feeling great. And I don't want to have too much, that's the dangerous time when people sign up for 20 races because they're feeling on top of the world. But, at least you're keeping some semblance of, kind of holding back, which is great. But at the same time, you have some really interesting goals and stuff. So, Chris, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your story. Like I said, I'm envious of, the journey you've been on. It just is something that a lot of us aspire to do. So when you were doing the vlogging and blogging and stuff, it was really great to just sort of kind of hear and learn about through your lens, kind of how the experience was. So it was great. And, best of luck at, the North Face and everything else coming up.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I mean, the takeaway for me, I hope nobody is disappointed with my decision to return to work. And I definitely don't want folks to think that this was like something that was forced and it was a financial obligation or some other pressure that is requiring me to get back to work. This is very much my own decision. And I think having the opportunity to step away and see what that's like and know that I actually prefer having a little bit more going on in my life to balance it was a great lesson for me to learn. And I'm very excited about now knowing what I was able to do with that time to prioritize correctly, to put in the important training blocks and do a good job of balancing. If work needs to be the priority, I'll make it. But if there's times when training is going to be number one, then hopefully my boss and my office and my team at work will also understand that. And hopefully they've seen how important this is to me based on all the miles I've put in. So yeah, I'm excited to hopefully share this podcast is probably a good start for me to start resharing my story, and hopefully the Mocko show will make a return in the not too distant future.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Intelligent Racer Podcast. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit www.intelligentracer.com. Also, be sure to check us out on social media, and please review us on your podcast directory. Join us next time for another edition of the Intelligent Racer.